April 1945. The war in Europe was almost over. Yet in Western Germany, one of the largest armies the Wehrmacht had left still stood in the field. It was called Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, a man known as one of Hitler's most capable defensive leaders. His forces were hardened by years of war. They included panzer divisions that had fought in Normandy, infantry divisions that had survived on the Eastern Front, and paratroopers who had resisted in Italy. More than 300,000 combat troops, and nearly 500,000 men in total once you counted supply personnel, engineers, and rear units, were packed into Germany's Ruhr industrial region. On paper, they were still a powerful force. They had ammunition, fortified positions, and terrain that favored the defender. Yet within weeks, this massive army would lay down its weapons almost without a fight. The largest single surrender of German forces on the Western Front would unfold not through bloody battles, but through a quiet collapse of will. The Ruhr Pocket became the place where the German army realized something terrifying. It was not simply that America had more tanks, more artillery, and more planes. The Germans had faced material superiority before, especially against the Soviets. They had always believed that superior training, discipline, and leadership could overcome such odds. But in April 1945, they discovered that the Americans had built a new way of making war. It was not a style of fighting that depended on heroic last stands or bold tactical maneuvers. It was a system, a machine that made courage and skill meaningless, because the outcome was decided before the battle even began. At the start of April, American armored spearheads crossed the Rhine River in force. Within days, they advanced with such speed that German commanders struggled to understand what was happening. In only 12 days, the Americans achieved what German military theory said was impossible: the complete encirclement of an entire army group. By April 4th, the Ruhr region was surrounded on all sides. More than 430,000 German troops were trapped in a pocket 50 miles across. German doctrine taught that encirclement was not the end. At Stalingrad, at Kiev, at countless battles on the Eastern Front, German troops had fought their way out before. They had broken pockets through speed, surprise, and sheer determination. Field Marshal Model and his generals believed the same could be done again. The Ruhr was filled with natural defenses. Rivers and canals cut through the region. Industrial complexes with steel and concrete buildings could be turned into fortresses. Mines, rail lines, and urban blocks offered perfect ground for defense. For months, German engineers had prepared. They wired bridges with explosives, dug anti-tank ditches, and created interlocking fields of fire. They built artillery positions to cover every major road. German officers studied American tactics carefully and prepared countermeasures. They expected that if the Americans attacked, they could bleed them badly, inflicting 3 to 5 casualties for every defender lost. If they could hold long enough, perhaps new German weapons or peace negotiations might still change the outcome of the war. But what happened after the pocket was sealed shocked them. The Americans did not come charging into the Ruhr to smash the defenses in frontal assaults. Instead, they turned on their system. Every move the Germans made was observed, anticipated, and crushed before it could matter. American reconnaissance aircraft flew timed patterns over the pocket every day, photographing every road, every bridge, every movement. The pictures were developed and studied within hours. Artillery officers used them to predict where German troops were moving, and then shelled not the positions they held, but the places they were heading. German soldiers described the fire as uncanny, as if the Americans knew their plans in advance. When German columns tried to shift at night, they were caught by airstrikes the next morning. When they concentrated for counterattacks, they were ripped apart by artillery barrages that struck from multiple directions at the exact same second. American artillery commanders had perfected a system called time on target. Dozens of guns, scattered across miles, would fire so that every shell arrived within seconds. To the Germans, it felt like the sky itself exploded. This was only the beginning. American armored divisions did not fight to take German strongpoints directly. They bypassed them, using radio coordination and air reconnaissance to exploit any gap. Tank columns punched through weak spots before German commanders even realized they existed. By the time orders for counterattacks filtered down through German headquarters, the situation had already changed. Their divisions found themselves cut off from supplies without even seeing the enemy. A German officer later wrote that his men were always preparing to fight. Yesterday's battle while the Americans were already moving toward tomorrow's. The effect on German morale was devastating. These were not inexperienced troops. Many had survived the horrors of the Eastern Front, where Soviet armies threw overwhelming numbers and firepower at them. Against the Red Army, German soldiers had fought on even in hopeless situations, holding out for weeks or months at a time. But against the Americans in the Ruhr, that determination evaporated. Soldiers began to surrender in entire companies and battalions, sometimes without firing a shot. Why was it different? Part of the answer was the predictability of the American system. Against the Soviets, courage could still change something. A daring counterattack might slow the enemy. A skillful ambush might buy time. But against the Americans, every move brought the same result. Artillery, airstrikes, tanks appearing on the flanks. It did not matter how clever or brave you were. The system had already prepared the answer. One German divisional commander, General Harro von Elverfeld, tried to lead counterattacks to break out of the pocket. His tanks advanced a few hundred meters, only to be hit with devastating fire from the air and from artillery. He reported back that it was no longer war, but simply murder. He still had tanks, men, and ammunition, but no purpose. On April 15th, he surrendered his division with nearly 40 tanks still running and ammunition for several days of combat. He told his captors, "I surrendered not because we were beaten in battle, but because continuing meant only the useless death of my soldiers." This sense of futility spread like a disease through the pocket. Prisoners later told American interrogators that they felt helpless in a way they had never experienced before. One sergeant said, "Against the Russians, a brave man might survive. Against the Americans, bravery only meant you died for nothing." Field Marshal Model tried to hold his command together. He knew the situation was hopeless, but he could not bring himself to surrender. Hitler had declared the Ruhr an essential fortress, and Model had a reputation as the Führer's fireman, the man who could save desperate situations. Yet even he realized the system had broken his army. On April 17th, he gave local commanders permission to surrender if they believed resistance was pointless. With that order, he effectively dissolved his army group. A few days later, he walked into the woods and shot himself. By April 18th, more than 300,000 German soldiers had already laid down their arms. By the 21st, the pocket was completely cleared. In total, over 500,000 men surrendered when counting all the attached units. The largest mass capitulation on the Western Front. American casualties in the entire operation were about 12,000, with only 2,000 killed. German losses in combat were similar, around 10,000 dead, but the vast majority simply became prisoners. The ratio was astonishing, the exact opposite of what military theory said should happen when attackers face fortified defenders. What had taken place in the Ruhr was more than just another battle of World War II. It was the moment when industrial age warfare reached its most complete form. The Americans had not just defeated German forces, they had made them irrelevant. Their system integrated air power, artillery, armor, and logistics into one relentless machine. It removed the value of courage, skill, or tactical brilliance. German soldiers surrendered not because they were cowards, but because they realized that nothing they did could change the outcome. They had become obsolete. The trap was now fully closed, and inside the Ruhr Valley, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were caught like fish in a net. At first, many still hoped that somehow they could fight their way out, or that a miracle would come from Berlin. But the reality was harsher every single day. The Americans and their allies had perfected a rhythm of destruction that never allowed the enemy to rest. Artillery fired in perfect waves. Aircraft circled like hawks above the smoke, and armored columns pushed forward with unstoppable regularity. The German units were not destroyed in one dramatic battle, but dissolved hour by hour, day by day. It was like watching ice melt in the sun. For the German commanders, the shock was unbearable. General von Elverfeld, who tried to hold Dortmund, fought desperately but soon realized his city was already doomed. Supply lines were cut, communications broken, and every attempt to organize resistance collapsed before it could even begin. The American system was not only stronger, it was precise. It did not matter how brave the defenders were. The moment they appeared, they were marked, fixed, and destroyed. German reports from this time speak of complete hopelessness. Soldiers described it as fighting against an invisible hand that always knew where they were and what they were trying to do. General Walter Model, the man in charge of the whole Army Group B, was perhaps the one who understood the situation most clearly. He had once been called the Führer's fireman, a man who could stop disasters and restore order, but in the Ruhr Pocket he faced something he had never seen before. No matter what plan he made, the Americans had already prepared the counter. No matter what resistance he tried to organize, the artillery and tanks broke it before it could grow. Model moved from one headquarters to another, urging his soldiers to fight on, but he knew deep down that it was all meaningless. This was not a battle he could win. This was the slow suffocation of an army. As the days passed, the German soldiers themselves began to feel the futility. At first, many groups fought with energy, but soon they realized that courage only led to more dead friends and no result. Columns of prisoners began to form, stretching down the roads. They marched past the same civilians they once defended, but now they were disarmed, hungry, and beaten. The Americans were astonished at the scale. Whole divisions walked into captivity without firing a shot. The greatest army in Europe, once feared across the continent, was now surrendering by the thousands every single day. The system of the Americans was simple and devastating. It was not about individual brilliance or heroic last stands. It was about making war into an assembly line, a machine that ground down the enemy with predictable steps. First surround, then divide, then bombard, then advance. The soldiers in the pocket understood this pattern, and that was the true defeat. They no longer believed they were fighting another army of men. They believed they were facing a machine that never tired, never stopped, and never lost its rhythm. That belief killed their will long before their bodies were destroyed. By mid-April, the collapse was almost total. Entire regiments gave up without even pretending to resist. American military police had to organize massive camps just to hold the flood of prisoners. It was a sight the world had never seen before. In the end, nearly 325,000 German soldiers were captured. It was larger than the surrender at Stalingrad, but with one key difference. At Stalingrad, the German soldiers had fought until starvation. Frost and bullets left them no choice. In the Ruhr, they laid down their arms while still supplied, still clothed, still in better condition. They surrendered not because they had no food, but because they had no hope. General Model refused to share that fate. He dismissed his staff and wandered into the forest near Düsseldorf. There, realizing the end had come, he pulled out his pistol and ended his own life. He could not bear the thought of standing in front of the enemy as a prisoner. His death was symbolic of the whole German command system in the West. Once proud, once certain of their mastery, now broken and irrelevant. The war was not yet over. But the Ruhr Pocket showed everyone what the new world of war looked like. Courage, tradition, and the will to fight could no longer change the outcome when facing an opponent who treated war as a science of systems. The Germans had learned tactics, doctrine, and maneuver from the wars of the past. The Americans showed them that in the future, victory belonged to those who mastered organization, technology, and method. For the civilians in the Ruhr, the days were filled with fear, hunger, and exhaustion. Cities burned, factories were smashed, and homes collapsed under the endless bombardment. Yet for many of them, the sight of German soldiers surrendering was almost a relief. The war that had brought nothing but destruction was finally dying around them. They watched the endless streams of prisoners with a mixture of sadness and silent joy. The Third Reich that promised 1,000 years was ending in rows of defeated men walking east under guard. For the Americans, the Ruhr was proof that their way of war worked. It was the largest single bag of prisoners they ever captured, and it confirmed that with enough resources, coordination, and persistence, they could crush even the most determined enemy. Officers wrote in their diaries that the Germans did not collapse because they were starved, but because they had been outthought, outsupplied, and outorganized. One lieutenant noted that the German soldiers still looked tough, still had their weapons, but when we asked them to march, they simply obeyed. The will to resist had evaporated. The Ruhr Pocket was more than just a battle. It was the final proof that the age of individual heroism in war was ending. In its place came the dominance of the system, the machine, the organized application of power. The German soldiers surrendered not only their rifles, but their faith in the old ways of war. From that point on, every army in the world would study what happened in April 1945. They would learn that courage could not stop a system, and that once the machine of modern war began to move, no amount of bravery could block its path. Thus the Ruhr Pocket closed not only on 300,000 soldiers, but on an entire chapter of history. It marked the death of the German army as a fighting force, and the birth of a new reality in warfare. A reality where battles were no longer decided by the strongest will, but by the most perfect system. The Americans had not only won a battle, they had changed the very meaning of war itself.